on bullying. It's sort of a side thing I've always been a little bit interested in. And it's very popular now. I mean, you read a lot about bullying, the psychology of bullying, what is that all about? One of the most interesting parts of it, I mean, if there's really interesting parts about bullying, but they talk about kind of types of bullying, and they talk about that there's a certain cycle within it, if you will, that cycle of that bullying violence. And the more interesting of it is the idea of, let's say particularly a child, let's say in one grade, that kid is the aggressor. They are the bully. But then something shifts. Perhaps the other gang moves away. Perhaps somebody grows a little bit taller. Who knows? But that same child in a year, or in 6 months, or in 2 weeks, can then become the victim of bullying. Similarly, too, you have victims of bullying who, with a little bit of time, can then become bullies. And the cycle continues and continues and continues. But that, to me, was one of the more interesting things that I came across. Is, there are people who are pure, the pure bully, like, the Farkas from, A Christmas Story, who's tormenting poor Ralphie. Or you have the poor victim who, well, like my dog is like the poor victim, I swear. If there's other dogs around, they're going to be jumping on him and biting him. But that most actually fall within that middle range of sometimes the bully, sometimes the victim. And it's a cycle. They talked about one of the best ways to sort of break down bullying. And, a lot of times, parents, you can feel very powerless, right? You think, well, what can I do? Somebody's bullying my child. But believe it or not, parents have a lot of sway and stuff like that. But you think, what do I know? But in fact, we do. What a good thing that is. And that can help break that cycle. Today's gospel, Jesus says, love your enemies. Love your enemies. Do good to them. Certainly, it's easy to love those who are lovable. It's easy to love the people that we love. It's easy to love our friends. It's easy, well, sometimes it's easy to love our families, but it's easy to love our families. But it is not easy to love the enemy. And in fact, we witness it in our popular culture, the desire to kind of want to get one right back at the other. And so once one side has lobbed, one over the fence, they're going to lob one right back. And the cycle continues and it continues and continues, and we don't get any further. And the cycle of violence is the same way. One person picks up a knife, another person picks up a gun. One person picks up a brick, somebody's picking up a stick. And the cycle of violence continues. But Jesus' words are radical. They're absolutely radical. Love your enemies. It disrupts that cycle. Now, the interesting thing within bullying, within violence, within these sort of things, what they talk about, that surprisingly enough, the most effective way to kind of stop somebody in that sort of rage and that anger is to ask a question. That for whatever reason, it sort of shocks the other person because you can't kind of be at the same time so rageful and also curious. There's a man named John Yoder who was an ethicist in the Mennonite church and put together a book called What Would You Do? And it is a pacifist, a Christian pacifist answer to the question of the confrontation of violence. So when you're confronted with violence, when you're confronted with your enemy, should you swing back? And his argument is, no, you don't have to swing back. But that also doesn't mean that you lie down on the ground and say, oh, please, stop upon me. I'd really enjoy that. But he talks about, in particular, through these examples of times when somebody has asked a question and that bully or that enemy has had to stop. And in fact, both people are taken out of that cycle and something new can occur. And it reminds me of a story that Hill Riddle told about his early time in ministry. And I don't know if any of you know who that is, but Hill Riddle was the priest at Trinity Church for about, 25 years in New Orleans, Trinity Church on Jackson Avenue. And he told a story about his time in seminary, about how they would try different services in seminary, which is true. They make you go through pretty much every single service in the prayer book, and then sometimes they'll expose you to the newfangled different ones, like enriching our worship, which is okay. And then they'll pull out things like, oh, here's the New Zealand prayer book, let's try this one out. And they were showing them these different forms of prayer, and they would do it in all of their chapel times. Just trying new things, praying a different way, so that as priests, you can be ready to try something else if it works, if it's good for prayer. Now, as it goes in seminary, you always have a mortal enemy. I don't know what that rule is, but you just have to have a mortal enemy in seminary. There's always somebody who, it's like the jab in the eye to be around. They're difficult, they're hard. And Hill, in his saintliness, even Hill had someone who would have been that mortal enemy, because those fights, those bizarre esoteric fights about, Gnosticism, they're so vitally important when you're sitting there in the rectory eating your meal, but you must give that person a stink eye and never want to be around them again. It's a strange thing to be thinking that you're supposed to be trying to foster peace, and yet at the same time you just can't get over the amount of hate you feel for that person sitting right next to you. And Hill told this story, and he spoke about how one day in chapel they were exposed to a practice of a different culture, of how they were going to exchange the peace. The celebrant explained to everyone, now this is what you're going to do at the peace. You will stand, you will turn to the person next to you, you will lay your hands upon their shoulders, they will lay their hands upon your shoulders, you will look them in the eye, and you will say, the peace of the Lord be always with you. And you will do it to the person on your left or on your right, or the person who's sitting before you, and this person sitting behind you. Well, they got to that point in the service. The celebrant said, peace of the Lord be always with you. Hill, seeing that there was neither someone on the left or the right, there was a person in front of him. Okay, peace of the Lord be always with you. That other person, peace of the Lord always with you. Turned around, and it was him. As you can imagine, putting his hands upon his shoulders, and there's that desire to just... But they lay hands upon each other's shoulders. And they look each other in the eye. And he wishes him the peace of the Lord be always with you. And that mortal enemy, peace of the Lord be always with you. And as Hill said, that after that he could never look at that person the same. He was changed. And that cycle was broken. In this gospel today, Jesus is asking us to be agents of mercy. Agents of mercy and peace. Not just passive, but actively seeking that out. Actively sharing that with others. Actively sharing love. And being merciful. And it is in that action that we express that love of God. that mercy of God that has been offered to us. And it's that work of showing mercy, of being merciful, of forgiving, of loving, of putting down the sword, that we disrupt that cycle of violence. And we disrupt that anger and that rhetoric of cruelty. And true mercy can flow. And we can see each other in a different way. And bit by bit, change this world that is around